the discussion is often the hardest part of the paper to write because it's in a way, it's the least technical. So the methods and results I often find very easy to write, very straightforward, because I know what I've done, I know what I found, I know which results I need to focus on, but then interpreting them is another matter entirely. But interpreting the results and putting them in context in the discussion is really important, because it is your chance to make your study stand out and as I to make your study shine. So to really demonstrate the relevance and the importance of your work and to show how it advances the field. So I always like to think of the discussion as my playground. It's my chance to make the most of my results and to put my findings in context. And a good discussion needs to synthesize the results of your study with published evidence, and it needs to use that solid evidence to interpret findings. And a really good discussion links the results to topics presented in the introduction. So again, we have context, the knowledge gaps, the research aims, and the hypotheses. We need to be able, the reader needs to see how the discussion links back to these topics in the introduction. And again, it comes back to this idea that our research aims and hypotheses are the absolute essential thing to think about to structure the rest of the paper. When I get, as an editor, when I get reviewer comments back or comments from a handling editor saying this discussion is unstructured, or it's very hard to follow the discussion, or it's usually because the discussion does not refer back to those initial aims and hypotheses, does not refer back to that broad context that was provided in the introduction. And I always recommend to authors that they frame the discussion around their hypotheses and their questions. And this is a really good way of making sure that the reader can see those links and can understand how your study or how your results have addressed your study aims. So the discussion really is the essence of the paper. When I read papers, I tend to skip the methods and the results, and I will go straight to the discussion, because the discussion often tells me what I need to know about the study. So we need to think carefully about what the purpose of the discussion is. What are we giving the reader? Well, it's, first of all, interpreting your findings in a wider context. So placing your findings in against the background of what we already know and understand about the topic. So other published results, for example. Then, very important, demonstrating how your results address your aims and hypotheses. Showing how your findings add to existing knowledge. So how do they go beyond previous work? And of course, you may want to highlight knowledge gaps, directions for future work, and obviously demonstrate how your study advances research in this field. So we can think about a series of questions we can ask ourselves before we start writing the discussion. The first is, have you met your research aims? And if not, why not? Then, have you filled any of the knowledge gaps that you highlighted in the introduction? This is really important. Obviously, how do your findings fit into previous research, but how do they go beyond it and add to our understanding? Are there any remaining questions? And have new questions emerged from your work? So have your results shown a new knowledge gap or raised a new question? And then, of course, what is the wider relevance of your results? What are the implications of the study? So these are really, really key questions that you can ask as you're preparing or drafting your discussion section. If you can show all of these things, you're doing a pretty good job. What I should also mention, and this is really important, you do not have to explain everything. And this is something I often find, especially in early career researchers, this idea that we need to be able to explain every single result, even if it was unexpected. And nobody expects you to have the answers to everything. So one way of thinking about this is actually, if I can't explain a result, is this a new question that needs to be answered with a follow-up study? So I'll come back to that in a moment. What I'd like to do first is show you signs of a weak discussion. So these are largely based on my experience as a reviewer and editor, where I've sort of said, you know, nice study, but it is really let down by the discussion, or the discussion does not highlight the merits of the study. And there are four main types of discussion. The first type is what I call the saga, and this is where results are just repeated and then discussed sequentially without putting them in context. And this is actually how I was taught to write a discussion. But the big problem here is that the reader can't see how the results answer the research questions, and they can't see how the work addresses the field. So if I just go through each result in turn and say, this is what we found, this is how I interpret it, we're not synthesizing. We're not pulling our results together to provide a picture and show how we've addressed our aims. So if we think about framing the discussion around our hypotheses and around our research aims and interpreting them and explaining them by reference to previous work in that context, then we already have a much stronger discussion. I'll also, in the second session, I'll talk a little bit about how we might be able to do this, how we might be able to address this issue and actually synthesize results with the interpretation from the literature. Then the second type of weak discussion is what I think of as the detective story. And this is where I don't have an overview as a reader, but I'm given lots and lots of pieces of evidence, and then at the end, the authors tell me what it means. And this is very confusing. If you don't have the required prior knowledge of the study and the results, the reader will get confused. You will lose them. Because a lot of detail that we're giving and the interpretation we might be giving requires context. Otherwise, we can't understand it. And often, you know, if you don't give the key messages up front, then the links between the evidence and the relevance of that evidence is unclear. So in this case, we can use this funneling technique in the discussion to very good effect, starting big, finishing small. So we start each paragraph with a very clear take-home message or a clear indication what this paragraph is going to be about, and then we build in more detail. The third sign of a weak discussion is, and this is another one I see especially in early career researchers, is that the results are only discussed by direct comparison to other published work. And of course, it's important that we acknowledge previous work, and we must acknowledge previous work. We must also say clearly if other people have found similar results, for example, in a different ecosystem. This is very important to interpret our own work. But the big problem is if my discussion only says, oh yes, we found this, which is in agreement with this other study. We found X that is in contrast to the results of another study, then the reader is directed towards all of these other studies instead of focusing on the relevance of your work. You're highlighting other people's work instead of showing what you've achieved, and the advance to the field is not clear. So it makes the study sound confirmatory. So instead of making these direct comparisons, again, this technique of synthesizing your results with published findings is really important to show how you've advanced the field by filling remaining knowledge gaps and how your results go above and beyond other people's work. So a very good example of this that I see very frequently is where authors will make a direct comparison to another study and say, well, we found something different. So these people did the same study in a different ecosystem, but our findings show that our system is different. And that's it. There it ends. It's just this comparison. And for me as a reader, this is very unsatisfactory because I want to know why there is this difference. And actually being able to show that there is a difference between ecosystems that we need to consider, for example, is already filling a knowledge gap. So these kind of things are important when we're writing the discussion, this idea of relevance and advance. Then the final sign of a weak discussion is obviously where we overinterpret our results, or we start getting lost in speculation. And this is what I call the fairy tale because it's unrealistic. And the big issue here is that the reader loses confidence in your work. Often, so overinterpretation is interpretation that relies on variables that weren't measured. So we're starting to speculate, oh, well, this could be because of, I don't know, changes in microbial communities, and I haven't measured microbial communities. So unless I have very strong evidence that, for example, this phenomenon was explained through changes in microbial communities, and that's been shown in a lot of other work, then we're starting to rely too heavily on variables that were not measured in the present study. We can do it to a certain extent, but when most of our interpretation is based on other people's work rather than our own data, then it starts to become a bit of an issue. Mostly because we're not providing sufficient evidence to support conclusions, because ecosystems differ, taxa differ in their responses to treatments or variables, then we might not have very strong evidence. But as I said before, you don't need to explain everything. And if you need to speculate because you don't have the evidence, then you can also actually present that as a new hypothesis or a new direction for future research. So a knowledge gap that needs to be filled by further study. And then you've also demonstrated how your results are advancing the field. So when we think about the structure of the discussion, it's nice to start with a short paragraph that just summarizes the key findings of the study, puts them in context, a statement of whether or not you've addressed or met your study aims, whether you've rejected any of your hypotheses. This can just be a few sentences that provides a bit of a backdrop for the reader to understand what you're going to discuss and why. Then start each paragraph of the discussion with a clear statement of the key findings that you will discuss, ideally referring back to your study aims and hypotheses. And then within the paragraph, present your lines of evidence for the wider relevance, interpret your findings by synthesizing your results with other people's research. What is also important is to give caveats or limitations to the study in context. So personally, I dislike having a separate section of limitations. Some people prefer that, but it's important to remember that if you put your the limitations of the study in a single section, you are drawing the reader's focus to the fact that your study has a lot of limitations. Instead, you want to give your limitations in context and then give the reader confidence that despite those limitations, your results are solid, your results are sound. And you can only do that if you put them in context and not in a separate section. And then, of course, you want to finish the discussion with conclusions about the wider relevance of your results. And here you can think about the way you structured your introduction in reverse. So you started with the global context, you gave the scientific context, and then the general issue the study was going to address, ending with the study. And now you're kind of starting with what you found and drawing conclusions about that wider context, showing the relevance of the study in that wider context.